Spring 2013. Dear family, pursuing a genealogical dream is a wonderful journey in itself, but building it for others who share branches on the family tree is even better. This is the story of my parents, Joseph Edward Haenn and Imogene Josephine Felin Haenn, and their family history. In the fall of 2012, we toured their family homes in the greater Philadelphia area and were able to develop a greater appreciation of their remarkable lives and their love of family. Hopefully, this short video will give you a sense of some of our shared family history. Before we get started, it might be helpful to understand how our family tree has grown since the 1800s. Let's begin with Imogene and Joseph and work our way back in time. Mother's parents were William C. Felin and Mary Cecilia O'Brien. Her maternal grandparents were John O'Brien and Mary Dunn. Her father's parents were Michael Felin and Mary Riley. Now moving to Dad's side of the family tree, his parents were George Joseph Haenn and Mary Cecilia Terry. His maternal grandparents were William and Margaret Terry, and his maternal great-grandmother was Ellen Terry. His father's parents were Joseph Antoine Haenn and Elizabeth Rothberg. Going in the other direction on the family tree are the 8 children of Imogene and Joe. Beginning in 1932, and over the course of 13 years, they were born in the following order: Joe Haenn, Louise Craig, Jean Rainey, Bobby Haenn, Joni Gaul, Betty Legal, Kathy Shannon, and Barbara Haenn. And now let's begin the house and history tour for the Haenn and Felin families. On Mother's side of the family, this is where the Philadelphia story began, at St. Stephen's Church on the corner of Broad and Butler Streets in North Philadelphia. This church is where Imogene's parents, William C. Felin and Mary Cecilia O'Brien, first met. Cecilia was the beautiful red-headed young woman who caught William's eye at a Sunday Mass. Together, they helped form a young adult social group in the parish that centered on playing the card game called euchre. St. Stephen's was also the parish of Cecilia's parents, John and Mary Dunn O'Brien. It was a church where Cecilia O'Brien married William C. Felin in 1901, and later where Imogene Josephine Felin was baptized. Regrettably, the first home of William and Cecilia O'Brien Felin no longer exists. Just a few blocks from St. Stephen's Church, the house, along with 4 others, was torn down to build the Temple University Children's Health Center. However, the remaining houses on the street depict the design and architectural style of their family home. Now an empty lot, this was the location of the home of Imogene's maternal grandparents, John and Mary Dunn O'Brien, and her mother, Mary Cecilia O'Brien. An example of a similar house, just a few doors south on Broad Street, illustrates the style and design of their home. The wedding reception of Mother's parents, William and Cecilia, took place here in 1901. As a child, Mother and her sister Agnes, together with her parents, briefly lived here with the O'Briens in 1907. Still lovingly cared for, this is the first home of Imogene Josephine Felin. Her family lived here from 1904 till 1907. As hospital births were not common at the time, this is most likely the place where Mother was born on October 6, 1905. When Mother was 3 years old, the young Felin family moved into their second home, where they lived from 1908 until 1910. By now, a younger sister named Irene had joined the family. From my interviews with Mother in 1976, she remarked that she had little memory of this house. St. Francis of Assisi Parish and School were the spiritual, social, and educational centers of the Felin lives from 1911 until 1922. All of Mother's early education took place here, from the first grade to the 12th. Apparently, she was quite a gifted student, as she skipped 2 of the 12 grades, completing her education at St. Francis in just 10 years. Located 2 blocks down the street from St. Francis Church is Mother's third home. It is the one she most identified with during her childhood years. She lived here from 1911 until 1922. The steep entry steps up to the house and her father's continuing illness, which affected his legs and mobility, provided them with the incentive to eventually move to their West Walnut Lane house. William C. Felin and his family moved to West Walnut Lane in 1922 as his neurological illness progressed. This house contained an elevator, which provided him easier access once inside the house. Grandfather William died here in the fall of 1926. Grandmother Cecilia also died here 6 months later in February of 1927. As was the custom of those times, the funeral vigils for both William and Cecilia took place inside this house. Aunt Agnes, Mother's sister, had already joined the Sisters of St. Joseph in Chestnut Hill by this time. Imogene continued to live here in this house with her sister Irene and her cousins Bess and Herb Rogers until she married Joseph Haenn in 1930. Since the 1940s, the house has had a variety of uses. For a number of years, it served as a small nursing home. In the 1970s, it was purchased for use as a fraternity house for Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. Sadly, it has fallen into serious disrepair. 264 West Walnut Lane is directly across the driveway from Mother's home. It was the residence of the family of William's older brother and very close friend, John, who was also his business partner in the John J. Felin Meat Company. John died in 1929. The Farwood Roadhouse is the first family home of Joseph and Imogene Felin Haenn. They lived here for 7 years, beginning in January of 1931. It was during those years that Joe, Louise, Jeannie, and Bobby Haenn were born. This is the Marion House, the second home for the Joseph Haenn family. Across the street from the schools we attended, we lived here from 1938 until 1953. During those years, Joni, Betty, Kathy, and Barbara were born. Margaret Rogers came to live with us here when Joni was just a baby. And finally, the house in Haverford, which Dad called Breezewood. Here the family lived from 1953 until Mother's death in December of 1991. Aunt Mary Haenn, Dad's oldest sibling, lived here with us from 1960 until 1966. Now our history focus moves to Dad's side of the family in Delaware County. This large 3-story home in Darby, Pennsylvania, was purchased by George Joseph Haenn in 1895, when Joseph Edward Haenn, our father, was just 4 years old. The house was sold in 1914. Baby Paul, Dad's youngest brother, died here of pneumonia at 2 weeks of age in 1895. 6 years later, grandmother Mary Cecilia Terry Haenn also died here at age 43 after a 4-year struggle with tuberculosis. She left 7 children, 3 girls and 4 boys, to be raised by Granddaddy Haenn. They ranged in age from 19 to 5 years. St. Thomas the Apostle Church in Ivy Mills, Pennsylvania, is the oldest parish in the Diocese of Philadelphia. It was established in 1729. The current smaller church building was built in 1852, and it was inside this church that Joseph and Imogene Haenn married on November 12, 1930. Granddaddy Haenn, George Joseph, was confirmed here as a boy on September 19, 1869, at age 13. The church cemetery is the location of the graves of our first Haenn ancestors in America, Joseph Antoine and Elizabeth Rothberg Haenn. The day of our visit to St. Thomas, we stopped to remember our family members. Previously known as Concord Hill Nursery, the Haenn family farm was originally owned by Charles and Mary Peters, whom George Haenn worked for as a young boy at age 14. Mr. Peters owned several working farms in the area and was quite harsh with his employee, young George, who eventually ran away to Philadelphia in 1870 to find other work and to pursue an education at LaSalle Academy. Many years later, after George had successfully established a ship refitting business in the city of Philadelphia, he wanted to purchase a farm in the country where he could take his large family during the summer months. In 1897, George purchased the property called Concord Hill Nursery from his brother Joseph's estate, which was originally owned by Mr. Peters. He renamed this property High Hill Farm. At the time, the town where the farm was located was called Markham. There had been 3 main houses on this land. The residence of the Peters family burned in 1894 and was rebuilt the following year. That reconstructed house also burned down on July 4, 1904, when some fireworks went astray. It was again rebuilt and expanded to include an indoor kitchen and indoor plumbing in 1905. The house stood on approximately 150 acres of land and contained numerous fruit orchards. Our father, Joe, lived here for 30 years. Aunt Agnes, who was Dad's older sister, inherited the farm from her father in 1940 and lived there until her death in 1960. In her will, she gave the house and grounds to the Sisters of Mercy in Marion, Pennsylvania. It was then used as a novitiate and a retreat center called Villa St. Agnes. The current owners of the property have resumed calling the farm High Hill. Once part of the High Hill property and very near to the house is a magnificent barn that was constructed in 1910 after a fire burned the previous structure to the ground. It was designed and built by Lawrence Beebe, a well-known architect who specialized in building barns. Today, the barn is now a separate building from High Hill Farm and has been converted into a private residence. It continues to be the largest barn structure in Delaware County. And now to the last stop on our family history tour. This is the first Pennsylvania home of Joseph, Antoine, and Elizabeth Rothberg Haenn once they came to America from France in 1851. The farm was purchased in 1863 and remained in the family until Lizzie Haenn, their youngest daughter, died in 1942. The house was one of 4 tenant houses on a much larger property, then known as 4 Beech Farm. 2 of these original beech trees remain standing to the right of the house. At the base of the trees, water seeps out of the ground, marking the beginning of Ridley Creek. To the local Native American Indians, this was considered sacred ground. Until the early 1900s, they frequently came to this spot for spiritual exercises. How this location received the name of Three-Legged Farm, we do not know. But we do know that when the house was first built, it consisted of just 4 small rooms, 2 upstairs and 2 down, and had a very similar siding material as the old barn that still stands close to the house. 7 children, 3 girls and 4 boys, were raised at various times in this small house. Our grandfather was the 3rd oldest child. The house was expanded in 1958, nearly tripling the size of the original structure. The brick siding was gradually added over the years. The original structure is positioned on the right side of the house. The farm now consists of 12 of the original 14 acres and has a deep backyard, which was once the actual farming field. Directly behind the house stands a very old and very rare American chestnut tree, which was certainly there at the time of our ancestors when they lived on this property. And finally, for history purposes, we would like to end this video with photographs of the burial sites of our family members. These ancestors are the reason we are here. It's important to remember, honor, and thank them.